returning to Armenia with his wife Nune, who's here with us tonight. They will both be returning to Armenia at the end of the semester and continue their work at the American University of Armenia, I believe, where he is teaching. He has been the Kazan visiting professor in Armenian studies. He is the 19th that we've had, so we've had a very long series of distinguished visiting professors. And he had earned his doctoral degree in anthropology from the University of Oxford, and he's also done his dissertation there. And he is, before coming to Fresno, he was a Promise Armenian Institute postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Anthropology at UCLA, and he's also been a visiting scholar at the University of Cambridge. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Papazian to give the final in his three-part series of lectures. Dr. Papazian.
Right. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thanks for being here despite the rain. Thank you, Dr. Dermagalichian, for the introduction and for the invitation once again, since this is the last of my three-part series of lectures. I take the opportunity to thank Dr. Dermagalichian again for having me as a Kazan visiting professor and for organizing these lectures, during which I can share parts of my on the Armenians of Turkey. So, as Professor Dermagalichian said, I started this series first with the Christian Armenian community living in the Republic of Turkey today. That is the traditional Armenian community of Turkey. And the reason why I title my series Armenians and Other Armenians in Turkey has to do very much with how the Republic of Turkey as a state, as a nation state, understands, categorizes and defines Armenians. And according to that, there are also other Armenians. So that there are Armenians currently living in Turkey which do not really fall within the category of the Armenians as they are recognized by the Republic of Turkey, or as usually in discourse, when Armenians or others speak about the Armenians of Turkey, they do not often they do not come to mind. So one of those other Armenians, or at least two sub-segments or subgroups, were the Muslim Armenians and Alevi Armenians, about which I spoke last time, about a month ago. And they are other Armenians because they are not officially categorized as such, because they're not Christians. I spoke in length about this, I'm not going to repeat again. Whereas the migrant Armenians are, again, to some extent, other Armenians, not because they are not recognized as Armenians, but because they are not citizens of the Republic of Armenia, and their presence is acknowledged to some extent, but it is also legally not fully there. I'll cover this in more detail now, mainly because many of them are undocumented migrants or irregular migrants who come and go, or who stay there without really, legally being there, because of the conditions in which they live. And in any way, they constitute another type of being an Armenian in Turkey, which is different relatively, but also in some cases quite significantly different than the traditional Armenian identity of in Turkey. So I started this series by showing the first and fifth pages of a graphic short story that we made with Nune, my other half. She drew it. It's based on my research. So we've covered the Christian Armenians, we covered the Muslim and Alevi Armenians. Here on this fourth page, if I'm not mistaken, by the way, you can find the complete version of it if you search illustrating anthropology and then my name, you'll find it. That was an online exhibition of illustrated works on anthropology by the Royal Anthropological Institute in the UK. So on this page we see one of the migrant Armenians living in contemporary Armenia. Pay attention to the symbolism here. Everything, well, not everything, but many of the stuff that are here are connected to what I will be discussing. And let's see what he says. yes, blood makes one Armenian, he says, but that's not enough. One's conduct, one's way of life should also be Armenian-like for them to count as ideal Armenians. I can't really consider someone a true Armenian if, for instance, they do not show any concern for Armenia, if they do not treat it as their fatherland. Now, you might say that I've left Armenia myself. Before I move to the next slide, let's just pay attention to this listening to radio where we see is hearing about a news about a killing of an Armenian soldier on the Armenian-Azerbaijani border, which is here to symbolize their everyday connection with Armenia, their transnational links with the Republic of Armenia, although they are away from it. And then he continues explaining why he came here, but I had no other choice. I was unemployed and this is only temporary. It wasn't easy to leave Armenia, it was even harder to come to Turkey. I keep feeling bad. This is the enemy's country after all, he says, even if 100 years have passed since the genocide. And then finally he comes back to speaking about Armenianness, because my series and my work is really about different understandings of Armenianness as well, or Armeniannesses, if you want, amongst these different groups. And through Armenianness, he says, as we conceive it, also entails some moral conditions, like being hospitable, respecting one's elders, caring for the family. It requires that a man defend his honor and that a woman be decent and loyal to her husband. So different cultural background and different understandings which build into and which somehow contribute to the migrants' understanding of Armenian values, Armenian traditions, and based on that, on how they approach the other Armenians, the other Armeniannesses, and whether they accept those others as Armenians or not, or as ideal Armenians or not. Just like, as I covered previously, whether the Christian Armenians do accept or acknowledge the Muslim Armenians as Armenians or not, and so on and so on. So I'll come to these debates about Armenianness and other Armeniannesses and what constitutes an Armenian at the very end of this lecture. But let me go back and start by providing some general information about this migrant community by starting with the history of this community. When did it start? How do we have a migrant community? And then presenting some general information about their conditions, but also their sociological, demographic state, and so on and so on. So this community really came to exist, and we have it now as a third segment of Armenians in the Republic of Turkey since the early 1990s. There was some shuttle trading, some very, just periodical migration going back and forth at the very end of the Soviet Union, before the independence of Armenia, but a real migration and waves of migrations with people settling in Istanbul really started after the fall of the Soviet Union and the independence of Armenia. Now this was conditioned by two factors. First, there was crisis in the sending context, that is in Armenia, and then there was a pull factor for, let's say, conditions in the Republic of Turkey, in the receiving context, that made Turkey in particular, attractive for these migrants, which made them choose Turkey instead of Russia or the US or many other popular destinations as their destination. Now, what was happening in the sending context? There was a crisis, as I said, an energy crisis, security crisis, economic crisis since the very early 1990s. First, there was the devastating earthquake in 1988 that hit Spidak and Gyumri, the second largest city of Armenia. It was a huge earthquake with lots of losses, and in fact, many of the migrants now living and working in Armenia who are labor migrants, not just any type of migrant, particularly migrant workers, come from Gyumri, not all of them. Then there was political and economic remodeling of the country, of the state system generally, moving from state-centered socialism to capitalism, the liberalization of the economy, coming with privatization of the industries, of the factories, and so on, resulting in a loss of jobs, in the closing down of the number of factories, and then increasing poverty and increasing number of people having no jobs. And then finally there was the large-scale war with neighboring Azerbaijan over the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, which had declared its independence, its cessation from Soviet Azerbaijan right before the collapse of the Soviet Union, which resulted in turn in an economic blockade of Armenia by Turkey and Azerbaijan. And all this basically contributed to worsening of socioeconomic conditions and life in the Republic of Armenia. As a result, in the nascent republic, newly independent Republic of Armenia, as a result of which a huge migration started outside Armenia, emigration process or a huge emigration wave. Now, only a small fraction of those emigrating chose Turkey as a destination. Now, why did they choose Turkey? In parallel and in contrast to what was happening, the conditions in the newly independent Republic of Armenia, in Turkey there was an economic pull factor at those very same times. This was conditioned by some the neoliberalization of the economy, some neoliberal economic policies, starting from the 1980s, especially with the opening up of the economy, the privatization of especially the service sector, which resulted in an increasing demand for low-paid and undocumented, or if you want, extra-legal labor to be exploited in the neoliberal sector, or in the neoliberal economy. Especially in the service sector, which also incorporated migrant workers increasingly in growing numbers. So in these conditions, about 1% of post-Soviet Armenian migration, that was about 1 million in the total, about 1% is said to have chosen Turkey as its destination. Doesn't mean that all of those people came and remained in Turkey. They would come and stay for a few years and then return, but then yet others would come and go, and that's the process. That's the ongoing process until today. The people or the segment of those migrants, of those immigrants from Armenia that chose Turkey as their destination were the least privileged among the migrants. So the ones who did not have the capacities or the financial capacities primarily for traveling elsewhere, traveling to the US, arriving to the US or to Europe, to Paris, to France, to many other countries where post-Soviet Armenian migration has had as its destination, even Russia. So financial least privileges, because of Turkey's relative cheapness, I would ask them why have you chosen Turkey and not Russia, for instance? They would say because Turkey is cheaper. It's even cheaper than Russia, especially housing is cheaper in Turkey. So we could just come and stay here until we find something. Second, they would say there's a relative abundance of jobs compared to other destinations, thanks to what I just covered now, and not the least important, Turkey is close by. It's a neighboring country, so Turkey's proximity is a factor that also has made it attractive to these Armenians who could, although the border between Armenia and Turkey is closed, they could just take a bus for $100 and then take the bus through Tbilisi, through Georgia, and arrive in Istanbul in some 36 hours. So all these basically facilitated this migration process. And as a result of this, we now have about between 12 up to 30,000 Armenians, migrant Armenians living in Istanbul, and generally in Turkey, but particularly in Istanbul. Now, why I say between 12,000 and 30,000? You might say that that's a quite big difference. The reason is that we lack statistics, and we lack data and information and details on the conditions of the Armenians living in Turkey. And that is so because of primarily the fact that, well, two reasons. First of all, due to the lack of diplomatic relations between Armenia and Turkey, government agencies have not really paid much attention to this. They don't share the information, and so on and so on. Second reason is that a considerable part of this migration, as I said earlier, is undocumented. So many people, especially during the first decade in the early 1990s until recently, but now also have come to Turkey with touristic visas. So they could get their touristic visas in the port of entry. So they would just travel, come by bus, and while crossing from Georgia, they would just take a touristic visa, which allows them to stay just stay and visit, not work in Turkey for a few months, but then they would just overstay their touristic visas and they would remain. So this results in a condition that is quite difficult for us scholars to actually have proper data and statistics, how many, in what sectors, and so on and so on. But we can have some general information based on some surveys, some studies that Armenian and Turkish researchers have conducted, not just me. I have looked more into cultural matters, ideational matters that I'm going to cover in a bit, that relates to Armenianness, the construction of Armenian identity and all that, and relations with especially relations with the other Armenians living in Turkey, the other Armenian groups. But these studies reveal the following information. As I said, numbers ranging between 12,000 to 30,000. For instance, the Diaspora Ministry of the Republic of Armenia had put the number up to 20,000 a few years ago. The Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, but also Turkish media and Turkish politicians often bring this number to up to 100,000. But that is definitely not a credible number. The intention of it is to basically use this as somehow a leverage in politics and international politics. They do so when speaking about genocide recognition or other issues in relation to Armenia, and openly threatening, saying that we're so kind to have up to 100,000 Armenians living in our country illegally. We can put them outside whenever we want, and so on and so on. Whereas community representatives, but also independent scholars and researchers, speak about 12,000 and up to 30,000, as I said, which is a number that definitely varies from year to year. Many of them are undocumented, as I said. They are concentrated in Istanbul. In Istanbul, they are concentrated in Kumkapı, which is one of the oldest Armenian populated neighborhoods in Istanbul, which has now become really a super diverse neighborhood, hosting migrants from a host of countries. Migrants from Africa and continents, migrants from Africa, from Asia, from other post-Soviet countries, from Central Asia, and so on and so on. And it's a relatively cheaper neighborhood in terms of rent and so on, which makes it also affordable for these Armenian migrants. But there's another factor that makes Kumkapı attractive to them, and that is the old Armenian presence there. The Armenian Patriarchate in Istanbul is also still located there. It has been there since centuries, but it's still there and they live around it. But not only in Kumkapı, they live also in other neighborhoods. There are also some migrants in Antalya, especially where the service sector is very active, the beaches there and the hotels and the restaurants and so on. There are some in Trabzon, which is closer to Armenia. If you travel on bus and so on, you can just get there in a day or so. Now, an important factor there, an important information or statistic or data in terms of data, in terms of general composition of this community, is the gender imbalance, which again has been shifting recently, or has been coming to some balance recently, relative balance, but nevertheless there is that imbalance in which most of these labor migrants are women, not men. In contrast to most labor migration from Armenia to Russia. And this also has to do with the job opportunities that you have in these two countries. Mostly Armenian men go to seasonal migration to Russia because they work in the construction sector, on the roads, on constructing buildings, and so on and so on. As for women, Turkey is a better option because, as I covered in the past slide, the service sector is very active there. Both the hotels, the hotel industry, the restaurants, but also, and most importantly, domestic service. That is, if not most, but a large number of really Armenian migrants currently living in Istanbul are Armenian middle-aged and and older women who work in houses, in apartments, mostly of local Armenians. And I'm going to come back to that in a second because that is very much important for my discussion of relations with the local Armenians. That is really the place where these two groups really meet each other on a daily, if not an hourly basis. Most of these people often live in these, so they stay day and night there to take care of old Armenian people, or children, or generally families. But I also, as I said, there's some others work in hotels, restaurants, shops. There are some teachers. This is a limited number, and it's an exception. There are teachers working in the unregistered hunting school, to which I'm going to come in a second. There is shuttle trading, which is another option. They just buy stuff in Armenia, they bring it and they sell it there, often on the street. In Kumkapı, but just you walk and then you see migrants from different corners of the world selling their own product, including Armenians who would have brought with them cognac, Armenian wine, Armenian cognac, Armenian brandy, Armenian sujuk, and so on, Armenian lavash to sell it. This was a shop which I used to attend. The last time I went to Istanbul, it was already closed down, so it wasn't there anymore. I don't know currently whether it's there or not. This was an exception, perhaps one of the only few shops where Armenians could really have, Armenian migrants had really a shop, a space, and in this case it was a bakery. They would produce lavash. It was in Kumkapı, again in that neighborhood, and they would bake and sell the Armenian traditional bread of lavash. And finally, there are a small number of Armenian migrants who are not labor migrants. These are students from Armenia coming to Turkish universities, oftentimes to study, to get master's degrees in Turkish studies, after having finished their BA in Turkish studies in Armenia, oftentimes at the Yerevan State University. Some others come just for other other disciplines. And there is a small number, but again, perhaps a growing number of brides, migrant brides, who which has to do with relations between the local Armenian community and the Armenians arriving from Armenia. So some Istanbul Armenian young men, including one of my friends, for instance, would come to Armenia and take back with them brides. So there are also those people whom we can consider to be part of the migrant community. But really the bulk, or the central part of the community, is the labor migrants, of which a big part are women working, doing domestic work inside or for or with the local Armenian families of Istanbul. Now, these few tens of thousands of Armenians have only one working and one standing institution or organization, in contrast to the local Christian Armenian community, which has more than a dozen of Armenian schools and churches and so on and so on. The only thing they have is the Hrag school, which is worth more than a slide, in fact, a whole chapter. But I'll give some minutes to talk about the Hrag school. It's very important because it is really the only center they have, first. Second, it is important to me for my discussions because it is a center where Armenianness is produced, reproduced, constructed, being a school where children go, where children attend, where they learn to be Armenian. So I could go here, I could go to these rooms. I have spent days there. I taught voluntarily chess to the children, so that I be in touch with them doing my ethnographic fieldwork. I spend time with them and I see how Armenianness is taught there, importantly, in comparison to how Armenianness is taught in the Armenian local schools of the Istanbul Armenians. And you're going to see I'm going to cover some of the differences in a few slides later when I start discussing relations between the two sides. This school started in 2004 with only 7 students. At the time of my research, that is between 2015 2017, it had already 150 students and 15 teachers, all members of the migrant community. Now, who are these children? These children are children who are either born in Istanbul to migrant couples, to migrants who have come and met each other perhaps, or who have come together, young parents, young couples, and who have just had children. Now, what's sad, interesting, at the same time, is that some of these children are what Agamben would call bare lives, in the sense that they do not have any legal existence whatsoever, because they were born to undocumented parents, undocumented migrant parents in Istanbul, so they could not who could often not go back to Armenia, because if they would, then they would not be able to return to Turkey, where they have their jobs now. So these children have neither Armenian citizenship or passports yet, nor Turkish, obviously. And so they cannot attend, that is key. There's a reason why I said that. They cannot attend Turkish public schools. Whereas other refugees, other migrant children have the right to attend public schools in Turkey. These children do not, because many of them at least are undocumented. That's one reason. Second, of course, many of the parents would not want their children to attend Turkish schools for reasons that I will cover. For reasons that you could guess, but I will come back to in a few minutes. So it was just one of those mothers who just realized that her two children have no place to go, and she established this school in the basement, literally the basement, of the Armenian Protestant church in Gedikpaşa, with the help of the Armenian Protestant pastor doing service there, of course. She went to him and she said, we have this problem, could you give us at least some space? I have 7 children, including my 2 own, which I want to give some education to. And he just opened his church's doors, and they have established this school literally it's an underground school in 2 senses. It is literally underground, and it is underground in the sense that it is not registered. It's not on the registry of the Education Ministry of the Republic of Turkey, again because it is run by and attended by mostly, or at least partly, undocumented migrants. So it is literally underground in very, I would say, to some extent unbearable conditions, especially in winter, very dark, as you can see in the pictures, but nevertheless educating children up to 150 students. Now, the curriculum they follow is, and this is also very much important for our discussions of identity production, is the national curriculum that is taught in the Republic of Armenia. So they get all their books from Armenia, often with the help of the diaspora ministry, which used to exist until a few years ago. And then these children, the point of this school is to help these children take the necessary lessons until 9th grade, after which they are old enough to be sent back without their parents to Armenia, to their hometowns, or not their, in some cases not their hometowns, because some of them were born in Istanbul, but to the hometowns of their parents, and be able to continue their education following the Armenian national curriculum, and so on and so on. And that is what happens. They have already prepared, since 2004, they have already had a few generations that have returned to Armenia and have continued their studies there. And in this final part of the presentation, I come again, and of course, to their relations with the local Armenian community. And this is a quote by the Armenian Protestant pastor of this church, pictured here, which hosts the parenting school. And he said, so many years have already passed, but we still have 2 separate entities. The Hayastansis, meaning the Armenians of Armenia, standing on one side, and the locals on another. There is little mixing, limited contacts, not much relations between the 2 sides, except on the official level. And this quote really sums up the situation. On the official level, as the pastor says, there are links and there are connections. There is support, there is ongoing support by the local Armenian community, supporting basically these migrants, especially their school. But on the interpersonal level, just as again the pastor says, there is some distance, there is no mixing really, and there's even more than what he says. But I could see during my research, there is really boundary making again, and making boundaries, and really not perceiving the other as an other, perceiving the other as different. As one of them told me, for instance, a young woman who's there as a migrant worker working in a hotel as a receptionist. She told me that when I came here and I started at first seeing or meeting or encountering the local Armenians, I was so shocked and so surprised that I started keeping a diary which I titled Urishhaya, meaning in Armenian the other Armenian or the different Armenian. So these two communities, these two types, if you want, of Armenians, meeting each other, oftentimes find each other to be very, very different from what they think the Armenian, according to their constructs, should be or should look like. But let me start with the institutional openness that he also describes, just to give a bit of an idea about how does this work. So the church, for instance, the Armenian Protestant Church, provides the space to this school for free. That's not all. On the other hand, the Armenian Patriarchate of the Apostolic Armenians also helps this school. It makes charity lunches, for instance, where wealthy Armenian members of the local Armenian community attend, and they just do donations for the school. They have arranged for free healthcare for all children attending this school. Free healthcare in the Surpergic Armenian Hospital that is owned by the local Apostolic Armenian Church and community. The school also gets material support from the Turkish Red Crescent, but again, thanks to the mediation of the Armenian Patriarchate. Then the boarding school on Kınalıada, which is an island near Istanbul, where there's a boarding summer school, accepts these children during the summer because their parents have to work and they have no conditions of keeping them at home, even in summer. That is also one of the reasons behind the opening of that school. But that school does not function in summer, so this boarding school, the Armenian community, local community, has allowed children attending this school to attend that boarding school and stay there, spend the nights there as well during the whole of summer freely. And of course there are invitations from other schools, invitations from other local Armenian cultural associations extended to the children attending this school, and so on and so on. So again, on the institutional level, it seems that everything is as it should be, everything is brilliant, everything is fine, because these two Armenian communities are really interacting with each other. I would, for instance, I went and attended to the, to the concerts or to the events, to the theatrical performances in this ranting school organized by the migrant children, to which also came to attend students from other local Armenian schools. So on that level, relations are really there, and relations are also improving. One other thing to mention is an important contribution by the local Armenian community is that they lobbied the Ministry of Education in Turkey, and they succeeded to convince them to allow for these migrant Armenian children to attend the local Armenian schools. Now, this question might have already come to your mind when I was saying that they don't have access to the state schools and they needed this underground or not unregistered school. You might have asked them, why could not they attend the local Armenian schools? The reason is again, the reason lies again in the laws and in the legal context in which the local Armenian schools are established, and this has to do again to some extent with the Treaty of Lausanne, which has given the permission to its non-Muslim minorities to run their own schools, but for their own community. Now, as these Armenian immigrants do not officially belong to the Turkish Armenian community, because they are not citizens of the Republic of Turkey, let alone that they are also, most of them, undocumented, then they did not have the right to attend, to be registered legally in the local Armenian schools either. Now, thanks to pressure or lobbying or asking on the part of the local Armenian community, which again shows that there are contacts, there are relations, there is support, there has been an amendment in the law which has now allowed for these migrant children to attend these schools, but on the condition that they be considered as misafir öğrenciler. That means guest students. That means they can go to the local Armenian school, but when they graduate, they don't have a diploma, and so they cannot attend any university, neither in Turkey nor elsewhere in the world. So that makes it possible for people who have migrated to Istanbul, perhaps for a few years or for a year or so, to send their children to those schools. But those who know that they are here for a longer period, they think, what's the point of sending my child to a local Armenian school if they're not going to get any diplomas? That is why the surrounding school is still very much important for the community. So to conclude, there is, yes, cooperation and openness on the institutional, organizational, collective level, if you want. But on the interpersonal level, as I said, there is closure, there is some distance, and there is some boundary making. And this appears from both sides. The locals put some distance between themselves and the immigrants, and then there's a response to this. The immigrants also oftentimes are not really interested in, even not really interested in getting in touch or making friendship and so on with the local Armenians. And we have the picture that the pastor says. These are like separate communities. Now, why is this the case and how can we explain all this? I will start by explaining the locals' stances or the locals' drawing boundaries vis-à-vis the migrants. So during my meetings and conversations with local Christian Armenians, I often noticed an explicit lack of enthusiasm toward the migrants, some serious mistrust towards them, and in some cases even a preference to avoid contact with these migrants or these Hayastansis altogether. Now a very brief sketch of some of the reasons behind such distance and boundaries is as follows. First of all, there are some perceived cultural differences that constitute a barrier to communication and rapprochement between these two types of Armenians, if you like. The most simple of these being dialect, the difference of dialect. Armenians coming from the Republic of Armenia, they speak Eastern Armenian, whereas Armenians of Istanbul, if they speak Western Armenian. Now, and the Western Armenian they know and they speak throughout the decades has lost its strength because of the conditions of being an Armenian in Turkey, which I covered during the first lecture. What I mean here is that the Armenian of most or a majority or a big number of Istanbul Armenians is not so great. And when your Western Armenian is not so strong, understanding Eastern Armenian becomes even more difficult, although otherwise the two dialects are mostly mutually intelligible. So that's one basic cultural difference which acts as an inhibitor, as an inhibiting factor, as a factor that does not really allow much proximity or much communication. Second, there are, in the eyes of the local Armenian of Turkey, oftentimes these incoming migrants are seen as different, very different, and are disliked in terms of their manners and their lifestyle. And the local Armenians often use words or even descriptions that are even condescending or demeaning for the migrants. For instance, they often describe them as uncivilized, as uncultivated, or as rude people of the mountains, and so on and so on. This is what I've heard from many local Armenians with whom I spoke, with whom I discussed the topic of the migrants. Now, of course, one reason for this could be the fact that most of these immigrants are, many of them are not there to, for instance, work in the universities and so on and so on. So some of them at least are laborers. Many of them are laborers, and this is seen by the locals who employ them through those lenses of class difference as well, and through those relationships of power and relationships of inequality as well. In fact, many local Armenians' first and only contacts with migrants happen in the context of employer-employee relationship, where there is this disbalance or where there is this inequality of relationship from the very beginning. And second, there is some mistrust that is built upon some incidents of some migrant workers working in the domestic sector, working in the apartments of local Armenians, having done some robbery and theft and so on and so on. But you know, in such cases, a few such cases result in, you know, in applying that stereotype to the whole group, which is common not just which is common everywhere. It's not specific to Armenians in Istanbul vis-a-vis migrants coming from Armenia. It happens with all migrant groups in all over the world, right? But those migrants are this and that and that. I was told by several migrants that many of their friends, for instance, have been basically fired from their positions just because of other news of other migrants having done this or that in this or that apartment in Istanbul. The thing is, of course, that these migrant women are not protected legally, again because of being undocumented laborers. So there's no way they can go. There's no contract. There's no way they can appeal, and so on and so on. Now, as a reaction to this, there is some reactive boundary making on the part of the migrants, who, hearing these stories or experiencing local Armenians approaching them in a condescending manner and so on, would say that, you know, we don't want to do anything with them. We've come to them, we were hoping we would find Armenians who would help us in our difficult situation, but then we get discriminated against and so on, or even exploited in being, you know, working in their homes and so on. So we would even prefer not to work for them in some cases. But that is not all. Migrants' boundary making towards the local Armenians is also not purely reactive. There are other factors with which I will end this presentation, and these are mainly ideological ones that motivate them to draw boundaries against the local Armenians. To put it briefly and simply, the local Armenians often do not meet the expectations that many migrants have of Armenianness and of ideal Armenianness, as they put it. And so I end by this last slide, where I come back again to Armenianness, something that I discussed during this series, when I discussed how Armenianness is understood, perceived, and constructed and imagined on the part of the members of the Christian Armenian community, and then on the part of the Muslim and Alevi Armenians, who give to it more of a racial or primordial understanding based on their, you know, on their oftentimes cut relationships with their antecedents, with their ancestors, and so on. Whereas the local Armenian Christian community puts very much emphasis on the church and on the role of Christianity in defining Armenianness. And so we come to the Armenianness as understood, constructed, and reconstructed in this very school. That is why it was a very important site of fieldwork for me, on the part of the migrants. So to put it briefly, because I realize I'm close to the limit of my time, there are four important characteristics or building blocks of Armenian identity in their imagination, in their worldview. And these are the simplest being blood, again, which is to some extent similar to the Muslim or Alevi Armenians, saying that it's in our genes, we cannot escape it, it's not about religion. So they would say that, yes, a fundamental characteristic of being Armenian is being Armenian by blood. But then there are three other areas which, if you do not hold, if you do not really comply with, you are not the ideal Armenian. So you are an Armenian if you're an Armenian by blood, but in order to qualify for the ideal Armenian in their perceptions, you have to also abide by these three other, as I say, building blocks of Armenianness in their imagination. That is, first, the homeland, the Armenian statehood, if you want, as a fundamental, and you saw that in the graphic short story that Arthur, that guy, was saying. In them not being able to imagine an Armenian really not caring for Armenia. So belonging to Armenia as a homeland and considering Armenia to be one's homeland and caring for the state, the nation state of the Republic of Armenia is of fundamental relevance for them and for their understanding and also practice of being Armenian. And you see that when you look how they teach, what they teach to their children and how they bring their children basically in the school. That's one picture in which that's a picture taken in the church. It's the Choran basically. It's the altar of the church, of the Protestant Armenian church where the school is located, but then they are celebrating here the Independence Day of the Republic of Armenia. Now, remember the lecture before the lecture on in September, and remember the school and the pictures of the schools of the local Armenians. There, as I discussed, portraying the Armenian flag, celebrating the independence of the Republic of Armenia is something to avoid due to a history of pressure and distanciation from the Republic of Armenia and from anything Armenian elsewhere outside of Turkey under state pressure and so on and so on. So just by looking at this picture, we can already get a sense. I don't have much time to get into much details, but I think just by looking into these pictures and comparing with the picture of the other school, of the local Armenian schools, you could get an idea about how these two Armenians, how differently these two Armeniannesses could get and are in fact constructed. And so these migrants oftentimes would find it really unimaginable, or really not, they are not able to understand how some local Armenians could tell them, for instance, in, again, employer-employee relationships, if you don't like it, go back to your homeland. For instance, Karen would tell me, I cannot really understand. What do you mean by your homeland? If that is my homeland, do you mean that that is not your homeland? If that Armenia is not your homeland, and this Turkey is your homeland, then how are you an Armenian? That's the shock oftentimes these migrant Armenians live through, and which makes them question this time the Armenianness of the local Armenians, who in turn question the Armenianness of the Muslim Armenians, because of, how can you not be a Christian? How can you pray to Allah and then be an Armenian? I can tell and tell more and more about all these, but I have to move forward. Another important block is what they call Armenian moral values, or Armenian traditional morality, and so on and so on. And these are oftentimes related to kinship relations, gender relations, how an Armenian man should behave, how an Armenian woman should behave. And so all these constructs having to do with what they call, they use this word, Armenian traditional values, which for them are fundamental, again, to their understanding and to their construction of an Armenian. So an Armenian is like this. An Armenian behaves in this or that situation like this. Of course, I'm generalizing now. Not every single Armenian coming from Armenia shares these values and shares these approaches. But this is something that I could notice very, vividly during my field work and in my interviews. And again, working, and especially here comes the domestic and live-in domestic workers factor. Living with the families and with the local Armenian families, many of these women often realize that relationships, husband-wife relationships here, parent-child relationships here, relations here amongst the local Armenians do not look like what these relations look like in Armenia, right? For instance, how can a woman, I'm quoting some of the migrant women working, some of the domestic servants. They would say, these women here, the Istanbulite Armenian men, are not strong enough because the women can, for instance, not obey their orders, and so that we're not used to this stuff. Or how can a woman smoke? Or how can a child, for instance, enter and not say hi to his grandfather, or not, and so on and so on and so on. Or how can they start eating before the grandfather comes, and so on and so on. Which again is not necessarily the case for every single migrant, let alone every single Armenian living in Armenia today. But nevertheless, there are noticeable differences when it comes to relations in the family, and especially when it comes to intergender relations that are considered to be not Armenian enough. Voch Hayavari, they would say. Which again makes them question the Armenianness of the local Armenians. And finally, of course, that's not like saying they're not Armenians, but they're not the ideal type of Armenians as we conceive it. And finally, the Armenian-Turkish boundary for them, in their imagination, is fundamental. And this, again, I don't have time, but you can perhaps have a general guess of why and how the Turk is and remains the definitional, oftentimes, other of the Armenian. For Armenians, in many places, but importantly also in the Republic of Armenia, with that close boundary, close border there, literal close border there. And then coming and seeing some, blurring of the Turkish-Armenian boundary within the experiences and within the Armenianness or within the social existence or social experience of the local Armenians, again, brings some confusion to their mind, in the sense that, how can an Armenian even say I'm an Armenian in Turkish, some of them would tell me. Or how can an Armenian, for instance, have the picture of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk in his or her office? Where does our past go? Where is our history? What about the genocide? And all these questions that they raise, of course, without knowing much about the conditions of the local Armenians, the conditions they went through, what they lived through, and what I discussed and what I described as their habitus of perhaps invisibility or cautiousness and so on and so on. But what I'm trying to say here is that, again, the Turk as the other and the Turkish as what is disliked and as what is unwanted and what is tried and what is attempted to keep aside and away from the Armenian and from the Armenian identity is oftentimes visible amongst the local Armenians, which makes the migrants again question the Armenianness of these locals, whom they very often call Turkatsatayr, that is, Turkified Armenians. On the other hand, the Turkified Armenians, quote unquote, oftentimes do not shy away from, speaking about the migrants as I said, uncultivated, rude, and so on, mountain people, or Russified Armenians, or Sovietized Armenians, and so on and so on. Of course, this is not the end of the story in the sense that these migrants are still there, and since it has only been 30 years that they are here, and with time encounters do increase, encounters happen, and we have now some migrant children attending local Armenian schools, so it remains to be seen whether and to what extent these boundaries, these mutual boundaries between the two communities would get blurred or would get basically, they would be able perhaps to overcome, and they could perhaps reach to a point that their understandings of Armenianness would also be more flexible, just like it is the case with the Muslim Armenians, with the Alevi Armenians, getting encounters with the local Christian Armenians, and to some extent being able to challenge them, to challenge their understandings, their constructs and constructions of Armenianness, and to make and to bring some changes. I think I'll end it here now. Just seeing this picture is just remembered because I missed. This is just yet another fact, yet another example that shows again the difference. This is all migrants, male, of course, migrants in this case, men, who have come together and who have established a football team, a soccer team, and they participate with this team in competitions in which you have migrants from different countries participating, each with its own national flag and national name. So you have in Istanbul now a football soccer team, competing against Azerbaijan, against Ukraine, against Kazakhstan, and so on, under the banner of the Armenian flag, with the Armenian flag pictured here on their, you can see it. No, you cannot, in fact, but here's the Armenian national symbol, and then the national flag on shirts that they made, and you can probably read Armenia in bold white letters. This again this shows their allegiance or the importance of the Armenian statehood in their understanding and in their identities. In contrast to again the local Armenians who would often, for instance, shy away from such obvious showing of Armenian symbols, importantly and especially of the Armenian flag and so on and so on. I think I'll stop here, and I hope that this series did succeed in giving an idea about the different types of Armeniannesses in contemporary Turkey, and perhaps all these makes us think more about how identities, including Armenian identity, is socially and historically constructed, to an extent that you can have sometimes contrasting and even conflicting understandings of the identity under the very same banner or the very same ethnonym called Armenian. Thank you.